One, two, three. Good morning, everybody. Are you able to hear me? Can you hear me at the back? Do we need any adjustment to the microphone? Yes, everything all right? Yes, a thumb up, wonderful, that's good. Well, it's good to see you all again. Monday and Tuesday, you recall, we looked at two artists, Monet and Picasso, who had their own way of looking at the observed world, one landscape, one objects and people. And we also saw on Tuesday how Picasso went up to the brink of abstraction, but just stopped short and then had to back away. Yesterday, we looked at Dali, who delved inwardly, exploring the subconscious. And today, we're going to go a little bit deeper than the subconscious, searching for the soul. And that's quite a challenge for any artist, I'm sure you would agree. And you may or may not agree whether Kandinsky actually reached that end point. But what he did do was pave the road to abstraction and actually went beyond where Picasso stopped. The time was right, because we're looking at the first years of the 20th century, and thoughts were expanding rapidly, knowledge was expanding rapidly. Einstein was giving us a new perspective on the cosmos, time and space. J.J. Thomson and Ernest Rutherford were looking at the other end of the physics spectrum, at the structure of the nucleus. This was all extraordinary. And in the terms of the changes to society that these scientific advances made, they were monumental. Cities were now illuminated by electric light. Powered flight now seemed feasible. And the ubiquitous motor car was changing the very nature of society. And Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher, 19th century German philosopher, said that's all very well, material things get you only so far, but to get to a higher plane, it is only through art that that can be achieved. And so it was then that Kandinsky was well placed in this climate to explore absolute abstraction, and here's one example of his work. But whether he reached the soul in this is something that we can discuss. But somebody who did was Mark Rothko. And we'll be looking at Rothko, comparing him both in terms of his background and what he actually achieved. And I'm going to propose to you that Kandinsky approached the soul, but it was only Rothko who managed to identify it. So who was this Kandinsky? Well, he was a highly intelligent young man, born in 1866 in Moscow. His father was a wealthy tea merchant, and they came from a very cultivated family, and by the age of 6, he was playing both the piano and the cello. At the age of 19, he was admitted to Moscow University, where he read law and economics, and started work on a PhD thesis on the legality of laborers' wages, nothing to do with art whatsoever. At the end, when he got his thesis at the age of 27 in 1893, he was offered a professorship in a provincial Russian university, which he declined because he was interested in art, he was interested in music, he wanted simply to expand his knowledge of those things. But before doing so, he accepted a 3-year commission by the Russian Archaeological Association to explore Russian folk art in the northern reaches of Russia. And he spent 3 years researching that, which was going to be instrumental in some of the work he produced early on in his artistic career. In order to pursue his art, once he'd got his PhD thesis, he went to Munich, which was an artistic hive at the time, and there he enrolled in a private art school simply to learn the theory of art and to improve on his technique, because throughout his studies doing his PhD, he had used art as a form of recreation and relaxation. So he enjoyed doing that, but he wanted to learn more, a restlessly inquisitive mind, I'm sure. And then he enrolled in Munich. He went to the private art school to learn the techniques, but also took courses at the Munich Academy of Art, which was a highly respected institution. What triggered this extraordinary change in a man who was clearly an academic, intellectual, highly refined? What led him to even think about a possible career in art, which was what was going through his mind? And he relates that change to an exhibition he saw in Moscow before going to Munich of Claude Monet's grain stacks, with which you are intimately familiar. What struck him about the pictures that he saw at that exhibition was not the grain stacks themselves, but the effect the color and the shapes had on his mind. He was exhilarated by the sensation of the colors. And for him, this grain stack wasn't a grain stack so much as a medley of greens and yellows and whites and blues bursting out before him, as was the shadow in blue there that you can see. He was very affected by that sensually. While in Munich, he took a side trip to Holland. And there he started to explore in his own way, in this work which is called Beach Chairs Holland. You can see stacked up, looking like little sentinels there, the beach chairs all wrapped up to protect them against the inclement weather that beachgoers in Holland have to contend with. On the ground, you can see, are pebbles. And this is what he's rejoicing in, the shapes and the colors of those pebbles without any outline, color almost there for its own sake. And this is what appealed to him about painting. He took a trip to Paris, and in Saint-Cloud, he went to the park, was struck by the reflection of the light on the grass, but particularly in the bottom right-hand corner of that painting, you can see the fallen leaves. With his exaggerated sense of color, he represents these leaves with isolated patches of red and blue and purple, colors that were perhaps there if you really look very carefully, but his sensitive eye coned in on those, and that's what really exhilarated him about that scene. The 3 years he spent researching for the Russian Archaeological Association introduced him not only to Russian folklore, which he recorded, but also to folk art, which he may not have been familiar with. And this is a painting he did reminiscing about his time in the northern Russia on this folklore expedition of his. It's a couple on horseback, as you can see, and it's a remarkable work. It reflects Russian folk art, but this is Kandinsky evolving Russian folk art into this high pitch in which it looks as though he has a black velvet background on which jewels have been distributed. It's something that just struck me, and I think perhaps you might agree with that. In the background, we can see the turrets and domes of Moscow. And his folklore researches led him to compile a whole booklet of Russian folk stories, which he then built into this picture, which builds upon that sort of jewel-like black velvet jewelry image we've just seen, but consolidates the colors, and he populates this with the characters in Russian folk tales in a painting he just calls Old Russia, a motley crowd. And there are numerous characters there that are worth just pausing to look at. Let me just stand where I can see the screen properly here. Here, of course, central to the Russian Orthodox Church is the Madonna and Child, and the back, the bearded, big-hatted priest, before whom a man in green is bowing low. Here is a pilgrim in a green beard coming from a Russian folktale with a burden on his back. Here is another pilgrim joyfully blowing on a pipe. Here lovers are embracing, and here a young lady runs away from her suitor across the field. And in another folk story, battles take place, and you can see sticks and batons raised as people on horseback there and on the ground are fighting each other. The whole scene surveyed by the Kremlin looking down from above. And there can be no doubt to my mind that the link between Russian folklore painting and the jewel-like development of that Kandinsky developed in those two pictures was influenced to some extent by his membership of the Russian Orthodox Church. The glitter of the robes, the book binding that you can see, the cover on the altar there, and the other accoutrements and the icons that line the church, rich colors and great complexity. And this must have had some effect on Kandinsky's later work, I would suggest. In Munich, he spent many years in Munich, and having done these courses of art, he really felt he needed to be earning a bit of money, and to do so, he took the courage of actually opening a small private art school. And there, one of his pupils, Gabriel Munter, and he became lovers in effect. Kandinsky had actually married Anya, a fellow student at Moscow University many years previously, but they had grown apart and she'd not accompanied him to Munich. And now Kandinsky had this long-term relationship with Gabriel Munter. Gabriel, as you can see, this is a painting by her of Kandinsky, and I think she's captured quite beautifully his reserved personality. I think you can see that nicely. And she's added a little whimsy there. Can you see the green parrot that's mounted on the teapot to try to loosen him up a bit? And here's Kandinsky painting his first landscape paintings in the town of Marnow, which is a resort area in the foothills of the Bavarian Alps. And they went there together and spent many, many weeks there on many, many visits and did many, many paintings. And here is Kandinsky's first essay at a landscape painting in the town of Marnow. And you can see it's not just your regular landscape painting. I think he was influenced by Gauguin. You can see the patches of color. Look, for example, the house on the right-hand side there, the yellow walls there with just blobs of orange for the shutters by the windows, the red roof on either side, or on the left side of the picture there, and all outlined in sharp black outlines, very much owing to Gauguin's cloisonné method of painting that you probably recognize. But interestingly, the picture is loomed over, the street is loomed over by this cloud. And look at the colors in the cloud, the yellows, the greens, the purples, the blues, the pinks, and it's looming towards you. It's not just a simple landscape, and this was the sensitivity of Kandinsky in that scene. Now here we see something happening. This is a Murnau Street scene with the greenhouse, and you can see a bluish greenhouse over on the left-hand side of the screen there with a large tree covering part of it. But what is interesting, and what is foretelling of what is going to become of Kandinsky's work, is the collection of trees here. Can you see this tree here leaning forward? Easy to understand what that is, but what is this? We're not quite sure. And it looks as though the colors, whatever they represent, are beginning to separate themselves from the reality of the object that he was originally planning to paint. So there's a little autonomy developing now in the paint that he's using. By the following year, he's abandoned that thick black line, as you can see. The whole picture has become a bit lighter. And here is again from Murnau, looking towards the Bavarian Alps. We can see the mountain there. There's not much doubt as to what we're looking at. But already he's no longer showing any interest in representing the details of the mountain or the houses. Can you see on the left there, the triangle of the roof of the house here, and the house itself really represented just with blocks of color. Here is a church tower, here is the sun, all stylistically represented, and here we have a collection of gravestones in the churchyard. Here's the church tower. So you can see he's not interested in representation, he's interested in the visual effects of the color, and the picture will form itself as it may as a consequence of that. By the following year, the same scene. And you can see how he's breaking that up. We can still recognize the mountain peaks, I'm sure. It looks as though there may be a rainbow arching across the top of the picture. But that church tower is now represented simply by two lines going up beyond the limits of the canvas. But look what's happened to the gravestones. There they are at the front of the picture, along the bottom there. The color, the reds, the orange, the brown, the blue, the ochre, the colors are beginning to leave the gravestones as if they had a mind of their own. Until finally he arrives at the first true abstract painting in the history of Western art, which was a watercolor. He didn't do this for exhibition, but it was really a furtherance of this drift of colors away from the confines of the object. The object no longer mattered. The problem we have in looking at this, he just called this composition, watercolor. The problem we have looking at it, we are conditioned to try to identify things we can recognize. We might, for example, say that here is a jellyfish. Or you might say here, undoubtedly, that's a lizard. Can you see a tail and his head and his little limb? This was nowhere in the mind of Kandinsky, I'm quite sure. But we're conditioned, so we have to divest ourselves of this attempt to identify recognizable things if we need to get into his mindset. He was interested in colour and the emotional effects of colour. And that isn't a concept that's totally foreign to us. After all, we think of yellow as a happy colour. It's the sunshine, it's spring. We wear yellow for Easter. We think of brown as binding us to the earth. And we think of blue as the sky carrying our thoughts to the beyond. So these are not foreign concepts. And even those of us who are artistic Philistines would acknowledge that there is an emotional content to colour. And this is really what Kandinsky was all about. In addition to colour and painting, Kandinsky's second love was music. And he had an experience in Moscow before going to Munich of attending a performance of Wagner's Lohengrin. And when experiencing Lohengrin, he could see as he listened to the music, the notes produced visions of intense colour. It's a phenomenon neurophysiologists call synesthesia, in which one sensation triggers another. Some people get smells when they hear music or whatever. But for Kandinsky, it was visual. There was a link, which goes back to the Renaissance, where the philosophers would look at the ordered but mysterious movement of the heavenly bodies in the sky, which they would refer to as the music of the spheres. And for Kandinsky then, the music of the spheres represented colour. And of all the composers he felt most closely allied to psychologically was the atonal composer Arnold Schoenberg, whose music is difficult for me and I'm sure is difficult for many of you as well. Yet, with Schoenberg, he had an affinity, so much so that he wrote to the great man himself. And he said, "Dear Mr. Schoenberg, or Dr. Schoenberg, in your works, you have realized what I long for in music, the independent progress of individual voices to their own destinies." That's exactly what I try to find in my paintings, and isn't that exactly what he did with the colour leaving the gravestones in that churchyard and the independent voices of those colours in that abstract watercolour? So the affinity there is terribly close. Some months went by before Schoenberg actually responded, and he did so rather stiffly. He said, "Dear Mr. Kandinsky, I'm sending you the fourth movement of my second string quartet. I free myself in notes of an obligation I would like to have fulfilled long ago." In other words, sorry to be so tardy with my reply. The two of them met, and Kandinsky was delighted to discover that Schoenberg actually did painting as well, which was very interesting. And to return the compliment of receiving that, Kandinsky actually translated a work of a musicological essay that Schoenberg had written on octaves and something fifths, which I didn't really understand quite what it was, but he translated this work, esoteric work on music, into Russian as a thank you to Kandinsky for sending him this movement of his quartet, which I think is rather lovely. So bound was Kandinsky with music and colour, the two were almost interchangeable, that he actually classified is the wrong word, grouped together all his subsequent paintings using musical terminology. And for the simplest compositions, for the simplest paintings that he did, he called them impressions. And here is one of his impressions. Is this a totally abstract painting? I don't know. But we can recognize the colored features at the bottom of the picture here. Can you see these reminiscent of the tombstones that we saw, the gravestones, the colors leaving no boundary at all? But I just wonder whether this is a truly abstract painting or whether or not these represent the colors that come into Kandinsky's mind as he listens to various pitches on the keys played on the piano. And I just wonder whether these might be the keys of the piano itself, and whether this might be the body of the piano, a purely personal interpretation. I've no idea if Kandinsky intended that or not. But I raised the question, has he really completely left the observed world, although we can see the link between the sound and the color? His next most complex ideas, the paintings don't necessarily become complex, but the next grouping of paintings he calls not impressions, but improvisations. using musical terminology, which is quite lovely. It's not a complex painting, but the idea behind it is complex, and I think that's why it qualifies as that and rather not an impression. What we're looking at, I think, undoubtedly are human figures on the left. Would you agree? It seems to me very likely it's a grouping of figures. But where we have seen before on those gravestones in Murnau, the colour leaving, what we're now leaving the line, what we're now seeing, this is the intellectual Kandinsky at work here, we're now seeing the line leave the colour. And can you see how the figures now have sort of marching out of the picture there, having left their colour behind them? It's an intellectual exercise, and it's an abstract painting, and yet it isn't, because it still refers to the observed world. But this is where Kandinsky was at that particular moment in time. And then the most complex ideas he called compositions. And this is composition number 5. He just gave them numbers, 1 to however many he did. And in this, it's an abstract painting, you would think. Well, is it? And again, I come back to where the dilemma that Picasso had, not wanting to finally abandon the observed world as a point of reference. So it's all very well to do an abstract painting, but somehow you've got to anchor it in something. And here he's anchored it, I think, in the observed world, because here we can see a mountain peak for sure, I think. I think. Well, I've got some information for you in about 5 seconds which will explain that. Here we have a blue shape mounting this mound here, and here something. And it happens that I wasn't too far off in my estimation, because Kandinsky actually wrote a note about this particular picture in which he says, I'm portraying here a blue hill surmounted by a castle. And the castle, alongside the castle, are 2 warriors, here and here, with long lances. Now that really seems quite out of character, doesn't it, for a man who's come so far along the road to abstraction, yet referring in his own words to the observed world. So he's not quite made that leap. So he's virtually where Picasso was, I suppose, not quite sure whether to abandon the observed world or not. And then finally he does. And this is composition number 7. And I leave you in silence for 5 seconds to contemplate that picture, and I'm sure you are as baffled about that picture as I am, and if it makes you feel any better, and it certainly makes me feel better, this picture has baffled art historians for the past 100 years. The genesis of this picture is interesting because it was recorded by Gabriele Munter with a black and white photograph. It was painted over 4 days. And each day she took a picture of what he'd done on that day 1. And on day 1, there were far fewer squiggles, if I could use a disrespectful term for those emblems there on the canvas. Day 2, superimposed on the first day's squiggles were the next lot of squiggles, 3rd and 4th day, etc., till we end up with the final work. And art historians have been wrestling a fully abstract painting. There's nothing there that you can identify, that I can identify, that relates to the observed world. But art historians have been wrestling with this and referred back. He was a prolific writer as well as a great intellectual, Kandinsky, and they referred back to a book he had written some years previously, Über das Geistige in der Kunst, concerning the spiritual in art. And this is why the title of this reminisce with you is Seeking the Soul. Because it was spirituality he was after, and the mechanism, abstraction, was really just the mechanism. It wasn't what he was after for its own sake. He was seeking the soul and exploring an abstract way of doing it by detaching himself from the observed world, which he as yet hadn't quite done. Except in this last picture, composition number 7. You notice the emblem on the front of this book that he wrote harks back to this painting of a blue rider on a horse. He'd done this in his youth before just embarking on his formal art education. And with Franz Marc and August Mack, he formed together, if you want to develop an idea, give yourself a name. It's a sort of like a logo, and you can actually advertise yourself. And they called themselves the Blue Rider Group. And the principle of the Blue Rider Group, which Kandinsky was the premier member, was to extol the spiritual in art. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's really where that all came from. But the bottom line is that he produced this work, which is virtually unintelligible to me and to many other people, but obviously was the product of ferment in his mind as to what he was trying to achieve. Kandinsky's thoughts and progress in art were now arrested by the fact that in 1914, Tsar Nicholas II, here reviewing his troops who bow down before him, declares war on his cousin Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and the beginning of the First World War. And here's Kandinsky, a Russian, living in Germany, now in nominally enemy territory. So he and Gabriel now have to leave Munich, and they go to Switzerland, and there, after being together for many years, they part company. She goes to Sweden, and he goes back to his native Russia, which he had missed sorely. And back in his native Russia, he continued painting, but then in 1917, the success of the October Revolution overthrew the imperial regime, and now we have the development, the genesis of the Soviet Union. And Kandinsky's attitude to that, he came from a wealthy family of tea merchants, you remember, and as a result of the Russian October Revolution, he lost his home, he lost the family, lost their wealth, but nonetheless, he supported the principles of the revolution in this promise of a more egalitarian society. Lenin appointed his wife to the Commissariat for the People's Commissariat for Enlightenment. And this is Soviet speak, I suppose, for the Ministry of Culture. And so Lenin's wife was now the chief of the Commissariat for Enlightenment, and she seconded Kandinsky, because his reputation was now well established. She seconded him to join the Commissariat and appointed him director of the Moscow Museum of Painting, where he was charged with acquiring paintings for state institutions around the whole country. But before long, it was apparent that the paintings he was selecting were not in accord with the wishes of the Soviet government, who really wanted paintings which were basically propaganda to extol the virtues of the workers' paradise they had created. Kandinsky felt that art should serve a higher purpose. So he was not unhappy when in 1922 he received an invitation from Walter Gropius, who had founded in 1919 in the German city of Weimar the Bauhaus School of Applied Art and Architecture. And Gropius invited Kandinsky to join the faculty there. The aesthetic of the Bauhaus was to extol craft, elevate craft to the realm of art, a bit like William Morris had done with fabrics and wallpapers in England in the middle of the 19th century. And the same way that the constructivist art movement in the first decade of the old imperial Russia were elevating craft to the realm of art with their geometric compositions and constructions. The Bauhaus, however, unlike the Russian constructivists, allowed greater freedom to their faculty to be more expressive. The underlying aesthetic, though, was still that geometry, simple geometry, offered the most concise way of expressing form. And so this was the Bauhaus aesthetic, geometric recognition of symmetry and geometry. Yet there was a similar movement thriving. We have the constructivists in Russia in the first decade of the 20th century, the Bauhaus in Germany now, 1922 through to the 1930s. A similar movement was flourishing in the Netherlands, the style, de stijl. And that aesthetic, you can see, was to elevate simple things like a chair. What a lovely object this is. I don't know how comfortable it would be to sit in, but just to look at, it's very pleasing, I'm sure you would agree, and reflects the aesthetic of its chief proponent of the de stijl movement, which was Piet Mondrian. And you can see the connection there between, and once Mondrian had arrived at his definitive style, simple vertical lines, horizontal lines in black rectangles of primary colors, he stayed with that faithfully for the next 20 or 30 years. And that's the aesthetic there, reflecting all these principles. Because the Bauhaus was open to other ideas, not just rigid geometry, it invited Paul Klee, the Swiss painter, to come and join the faculty of the Bauhaus as well. And Klee was interested in the emotional effects of juxtaposition of colors and tones. And here you can see an example of his work, which indicates that the Bauhaus was much more open to ideas other than rigid geometry, which the other movements had extolled. And here's Casimir Malevich. Casimir Malevich had remained in Russia. He didn't join the Bauhaus, but he was chomping at the bit among the constructionists, you can see, and he's adding a little bit of whimsy to the rigidity of the constructionist movement. You can see he's got the angle there, the little orange coming in from the top right-hand corner onto this. It's almost like an aeroplane, isn't it, about to take off. And he's not absolutely rigid. Everything's at a little bit of an angle, and he's added this sort of teardrop going up at the top, out of the picture, as if it had a sort of spiritual component. So he's chomping at the bit to try to expand the aesthetic of that movement. And suddenly, the penny dropped with Kandinsky. How did he get out of that bind that he got himself into with composition number 7 that none of us could interpret? And the reason for that, it didn't have structure. Nothing wrong with the squiggles, disrespectful word, but you know what I mean. The Bauhaus gave him a structure. And there you can see the geometric lines that we saw in the Malevich picture just now, radiating in different angles, semicircles, circles, arcs. The structural geometry of the Bauhaus aesthetic, on which Kandinsky had superimposed his free-floating colors, which represented music or whatever it was it represented. And here, I think, for the first time, we have with Kandinsky something that is aesthetically pleasing as well as intellectually and emotionally satisfying. So I think the Bauhaus is what got Kandinsky back on the right track, or at least that's my personal interpretation of what happened to his development. 1933, Hitler comes to power in Germany, Bauhaus is closed, Kandinsky has to leave, and he goes to France, where he reverts, interestingly, to the folkloric patterns that we saw a little earlier. Also, abstract art, which we've seen examples of now, was becoming passé. We're now in the 1930s, and of course now it was all Dali and surrealism. But there was a collector in New York, Solomon R. Guggenheim, who bought up everything of Kandinsky that he possibly could. And because he was the main patron of Frank Lloyd Wright's new museum, which was called the Museum for Non-Objective Art, which was under construction in 1938 on Fifth Avenue opposite Central Park, he was the main benefactor of that museum, gave all his Kandinskys, which formed the core of the museum, which recognized his donation by changing the name of the museum to what we know now, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York. So if you want to see Kandinsky's, that's the best place to go because of that collection. Did Kandinsky reach the soul? I have to say no in my book, but I leave it to you. It's not for me to say what you respond to. After all, an artist puts his own heart and soul into what he does and then leaves it to the observer, and you either respond or you don't. So I leave it to you to say, did he reach the soul? I don't think he did. But this man, Marcus Rothkovich, a fellow Russian, but from an entirely different cultural background, I believe did. Marcus Rothkovich he was born in 1904 in the Great Russian Empire in what is now Lithuania. Tvisk was the little town in Lithuania, an important railway junction there. And coming from a Jewish family, he was confined to that dark area in southwest Russia known as the Pale of Settlement, where Russia's 5 million Jews, without special exemption, were obliged to live. At the time, the first years of the 20th century for Jews in Russia was very difficult. There was economic turmoil, there was political turmoil, after all, culminating in the successful October Revolution of 1917. So it doesn't require much imagination to know what it was like. And of course, the Jews were always the world's premier scapegoat, and all the ruin of Russia was actually all attributed to the Jews, and pogroms were a recurring event right through the first years of the 20th century. The family itself, though, was a secular family. He was the fourth child of a secular family. His father was a pharmacist, and three older siblings were given a secular education. They knew they were from Jewish background, but they weren't practicing Jews in any way at all. But something changed in 1903 with a pogrom in the town of Kishinev, in which the figures are uncertain, but it seems that something like 1,000 Jews were massacred in that town, and the town was burned. And that sent shockwaves through the Jewish communities throughout the Pale of Settlement, including the Rothko family. And it turned pharmacist father Rothko back to his roots and his Judaism, and he gave his son Marcus a classical Jewish theological seminary education in what would be called a yeshiva. And from the age of 4 to the age of 10, Marcus Rothko was educated in a yeshiva, where they studied day in, day out. Secular subjects hardly featured at all. It was all the study of the Torah and the convoluted, dense commentary of the Talmud. I don't know if you're familiar with the Talmud. If you look at a copy of the Talmud, it blows you away because there's a section of the Torah in the center, and round it, dense, dense, dense commentary by learned rabbis over the centuries, trying to untangle the mysteries of the words of the Torah. And this was the background to Marcus Rothko, his education, and it could not have failed to make a deep impression on him. The pogroms were something that had now reached America in terms of news. The New York Times sent a reporter to the Pale of Settlement to observe what was going on, and the reporter actually was written in an article in the New York Times describing what happened. Cossack soldiers would ride through the Jewish towns and villages, sabers drawn or whips in their hands, slashing at anybody they saw in the street, and then torching their houses as they rode away. So much so that this cartoon appeared in America, and you can see standing on the rock there, this is Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, pleading with Tsar Nicholas to stop the oppression of the Jews in Russia. So this was really a very powerful time, and as a consequence of the Kishinev massacre, pharmacist Rothko not only gave his son a traditional Jewish education, went back to his cultural roots, but also left a head of the family to go to America. And this is interesting. It says it's a card which says Happy New Year, Lashona Tova, and it depicts Russian Jewish immigrants being welcomed on the shores of America. The welcome wasn't always quite as overt as you can see there, because these represented competition who were coming for the communities that were already established. But nonetheless, Rothkovich's father went 2 years ahead of his family and went all the way across the continent of America to the town of Portland in Oregon on the west coast of America, where his brother had already left some years before and was now well established. 2 years later, the children and mother were sent for and arrived in Portland, Oregon. And to the dismay of Marcus Rothko, the fourth child, his father, whom he admired enormously and whom he hadn't seen for 2 years, contracted some disease and with 6 months had died. So he felt terribly deprived of his father, and this left a scar on him. At his father's funeral, he was the only one of the family who could recite the Kaddish, the mourner's prayer of the dead, in Hebrew. He was a very bright boy. He went to the Lincoln High School in Portland, where he studied not only the prescribed subjects, but also Greek and philosophy, and was one of only 3 graduates of the Lincoln High School to be granted a full scholarship to Yale University. In Yale, though, he was disillusioned very, very quickly. He expected it to be the Becker of learning, a beacon of intellectual ferment. Instead, he found the students there lethargic, intellectually lazy. He regarded the teachers as indifferent, and he had been excluded, as he had at the Lincoln High School, from the debating society. He was a great debater. He liked arguing, no doubt a result of his Talmudic education, which is always arguing, push and pull, all intellectual ferment about whatever you think, but nonetheless, that was his basis. And debating was essential to him. It was his lifeblood. He was debarred from debating at the Lincoln High School because his name was Rothko, and that smacked of Bolshevism, and we didn't want any Bolshes in our debating society. When he went to Yale, the same thing happened. He was excluded not only from the debating society, but also from other societies that he wanted to join. And he said later that he found in Yale the same anti-Semitism he had found in the Pale of Settlement in Russia, the same anti-Semitism he had found in the Lincoln High School, where he was debarred from participating in a number of things. But in Yale, that anti-Semitism was disguised by a thin, genteel veneer. He wrote, being excluded, he wouldn't just take it lying down, so he started a magazine, which he called the Yale Saturday Evening Pest. Isn't that lovely? And in that, he wrote articles decrying the disappointment he had in Yale, and he actually concluded one of his articles by describing Yale as the house of the dead. It was startling. I mean, a man with tremendous self-confidence, you would think. At the end of his second year, he simply left. And then the question is what to do. He had some friends who had gone to New York, and New York was bustle. Skyscrapers were being built left, right, and center, in spite of hard economic times. And he tagged along with his friends, stayed with a friend that he knew from Portland, who tagged him along to the Art Student League for 8 weeks so he could do a drawing course. So he did some drawing. He'd never done any art before at all. He went to Yale as a law student, but never finished his degree. And at the Art Student League, he seemed to have some talent, and he actually went on to another art school, which was a more legitimate art school there, where Barnett Newman, interestingly, was a fellow student, and they became good friends for many years. Being in New York, of course, was a very exciting place, and the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, had just opened, and they proudly showing their latest acquisition, which was Matisse's Red Studio. And what struck Marcus Rothko at this time was the fact that Matisse had painted this picture here of the Red Studio where you couldn't really tell where the floor was versus the wall at the back. And furthermore, the paintings weren't sort of stuck on the wall, they were sort of suspended in space. And this somehow resonated with Rothkovich's sensitivity. He also found another picture at the MoMA of Matisse, which Matisse called Notre Dame of Paris. Well, where's Notre Dame? We don't really see it. What we do see is a blue field with some black thin lines on it, and what looks for everything like a window at the top. And this painting of Matisse drew Rothko into the painting the same way it draws you into the painting and draws me into the painting. We want to stand on tiptoe and look through that window to see what's beyond, don't we? And there was another painting, even more difficult at first sight, which had the same effect on Rothko. And this is by Casimir Malevich, which he called White on White, leaving you to shrug your shoulders and say, well, is that art? But in fact, what Malevich was about was saying, can you see, I'm not sure if it projects, there is an inner rectangle within the outer rectangle. And Malevich says, enter the inner rectangle because that is where creation takes place. Well, accept it or not, but it resonated with Markovich in his head for later years. He went back to Portland, did his first essays now in painting because he recognized that this is in fact what he wanted to do. He was basically workless, no longer didn't have a law degree, nothing to do. He said, well, I think I'm going to try my hand at art and see what he can do. And here he starts painting, and already in his very first watercolor here, it's a view of Portland, and we can just see at the very, very, very top of the picture near the middle there, slightly to the left, the peak of the mountain that just lies just beyond Portland. And we can already see there that he's beginning to develop a sort of horizontality to his work. There's a band of browns and oranges where the town is, and then a bit of blue, and then the haze at the top. Just a little banded, nicely framed by the vegetation we can see. And here he does a beach scene. Some friends on the beach there with a dog. And again, we've got this band of brown at the top, which he just did, but interestingly, knowing what his mature work was going to be like, we can already see the seeds of that in here. But now he was 30 years old, and he paints this picture of himself feeling a bit sorry for himself because he doesn't really know where to go with his art. He hadn't had really much of a formal training, but he does get a job at the Brooklyn Jewish Center teaching drawing to the children. and this gives him a little bit of a stipend. Also, it's 1930 now, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt has a work program for people who are unemployed during the Great Depression, and that included a stipend of $100 per month to artists on the condition they produce one work of art which will be housed in a public building. Well, that sounded pretty good, and Rothko got onto that, and he was a recipient of that grant. The public building almost invariably turned out to be the local post office, but nonetheless, it was still something better than nothing. But interestingly, in this rather angry, depressed-looking self-portrait, he's painted his ear there red as a tribute to Van Gogh, who you remember in a fit of depression and anger with Gauguin slashed at his ear and took a lump off. So here he is like the wounded hero, if you like, struggling to make ends meet as an artist. And here he tries something else. He was very concerned with his writings. Because he was excluded at the Lincoln High School with being a member of the debating society, he wrote articles for the school magazine. And these articles were almost invariably related to a sense of exile and loneliness. And here he does a painting exactly depicting that sense of exile. We can see a bearded man at the back there with his arm, his wife next to him, and two children on the right-hand side in grey. Can you see there? And interestingly, the boy there has his foot off the plinth, partially in the abyss that separates them from this very formal-looking classical structure which represents the establishment of the country in which they've arrived. So this sense of exile, the sense of not fully belonging, remains with Rothko all his life. And here again, on the painting that he does, the subway, we can see two figures standing at the back just to the right of the center there, about to enter the subway, while two others descend down. We're not quite sure where they're going. A slight feeling of unease about this. He's not sure where he's going with his art, but this is what's inside him and what he's expressing. He then takes his work to an art dealer. He says, well, Rothko, you've got a problem. And so he says, well, what's that? He says, there are too many itches in New York. You need to change your name. What about Mark Rothko? And he says, okay. And from there on, he became Mark Rothko, which was an advantage because it separated him from the other immigrant artists. And then the dealer said to him, to demonstrate your bona fides as an artist, you need to refer back to the classical period of history. Well, advice, if you like. I'm not sure it was good advice. So Mark Rothko, as he now is, does his first essay in this painting here, which he does called The Omen of the Eagle. And he thumbed through Homer's Iliad until he found a story that he thought he could represent and came across this. I can't enlighten you as to what the omen of the eagle is in Homer's Iliad, but there he represents it. But again, there's the eagle in brown in the middle there. At the top, he's got Greek masks to indicate its origin. Below, some architectural device, and below that, some feet. Well, I'm not sure what to say about it. It's an unsatisfactory painting from just about every point of view, but he's still groping and trying to find his way. And here he does another mythological painting, this time of Mithras, the Greek myth of Mithras, who sits astride a golden animal, stabs it, and as the animal dies, it metamorphoses into a spirit. And here he is representing the metamorphosis of that golden animal into a spirit, doing what the art dealer said he should try to do. But interestingly, look at the shape there of that yellow metamorphosing creature, the horizontal band of yellow and these blobs. And we're going to see that develop in just a moment. 1943, he's now 46 years old and still not making it in the art world in any way. Uninvited, he makes a visit to the studio of Clyfford Still. Now, many of you will know Clyfford Still as an abstract painter of great merit and renown. Two unlikely friends you couldn't hope to meet. We met Pablo Picasso and George Braque on Tuesday, two very different personalities. Here we have two even more different personalities who became firm friends, and Clyfford Still became a great mentor to Rothko. Clyfford Still was a Calvinist from North Dakota who had the air of a biblical prophet and who had an unshakable belief in his own worth. Compared to Marcus Rothko, the Jewish immigrant who could never really fully integrate at all, full of self-doubt. Extraordinary relationship, and ultimately the two of them went off and taught together at an art school in San Francisco and were firm friends. And the reason for that, it was Clyfford Still who got Rothko onto the right track. And that right track came from Clyfford Still's own paintings. He said to Rothko, forget all this classical stuff, paint big, bold fields of color, and you'll find a way of emotionally expressing yourself through that. And he showed him an example of Clyfford Still's own work. And here we can see a red background, black, which is enveloping that. It's like a mystery of a cosmic void through which Clyfford Still has done this slash of brilliant white, which allows you to see beyond the void to what lies beyond. And this is what he was trying to tell Rothko, this is what you should do. Rothko starts exploring, and he starts off just with patches of color because color resonated with him in the same way that it did with Kandinsky. This could almost be a Kandinsky painting, couldn't it? The two really didn't have any connection at all, as far as I know, and yet the same aesthetic is there. They share this link, the value of color and its emotional content. So this is an early post-Clyfford Still encounter painting by Rothko, not entirely satisfactory, but nonetheless, I think you can sense the colors are beginning to hover a bit like they do in Kandinsky. And now he starts to group the colors together to sort of make it a bit more cohesive. And he starts by producing this band of ivory at the top here, running across the whole picture, superimposed on a bigger rectangle of yellow. And here the blues are coalescing, and again the white glares through there, doesn't it? I'm not sure if it projects sufficiently well, but the white, like Clyfford Still, slashed into the cosmic void. We can now see the same phenomenon occurring in Rothko's work. Until finally he arrives at a formula, not a finished work this, but a formula that he thinks he can adapt and develop. And so he does, using this format. About this time, he goes to a party in Greenwich Village in New York, and there he meets a young writer, Alice Bistel, who thinks Rothko is a genius. Why a genius, I'm not quite sure, because he'd been submitting his paintings for exhibition. But what happened was that Mrs. John D. Rockefeller heard of this interesting Russian painter who was doing something that was quite different from anybody else, and for one reason or another made a purchase of one of Rothko's multiform pictures that we've just seen, the colors that are trying to float on their own, and for which she paid him the princely sum of $1,000, which at the time was really quite substantial. So he was a known entity now in New York, and Alice Bistel thought he was a genius. Rothko had meanwhile married somebody he'd met at a Jewish day camp when he was a student. They had separated long ago. He was emotionally quite vulnerable, and within 2 months, the two of them were married and went on to live together for many years and had 2 children. But just about this time, 1943, 1944, the news of the Holocaust was reaching America. And now we have the conflicted Rothko, who had abandoned his Judaism following the death of his father. He felt that religion had nothing to offer him. Now the news of the Holocaust resonated in his distant memory of his Talmudic studies and of his cultural background. And he was tormented by that. Alice Bistel was a lively, good-looking Protestant girl. And it was a source of conflict, his children not being brought up Jewish, and this was a source of turmoil for him throughout his life. Following Clyfford Still's advice, he now starts to develop that rectangular pattern that we saw just now, where he said he found his formula. And for hours at a time, Rothko would sit on a chair in his studio, gazing at a canvas he was working on. Look at the size of the canvas, huge. And he quite deliberately wanted his canvas to be unframed, with no signature, and to be exhibited not where potential clients came to him in his studio saying, "Mr. Rothko, I love your work. Have you got something that will go with my living room sofa?" He had nothing but contempt for that. He wanted his works to be exhibited on their own in a low-light setting with no obstruction between the work and the observer, so you could walk right up to it with a view to actually entering into the picture, which is what he was trying to achieve. But how to do that technically was, of course, a huge challenge. But hours and hours he would spend in front of this, adding some color here or there. until he arrives at this formula of a portal. This doesn't project quite as vividly as it does in reality, but you can see the portal here is like a window, like we saw that Matisse blue picture looking, straining on tiptoe to see the Notre Dame Cathedral behind. He's adopting this portal to try to get the viewer to enter through that. And for that to be successful, this is work in progress. He's not there yet. It's work in progress, and he's trying to get this portal to hover, to give it a sort of three-dimensional effect away from the background, so that you will work your way through that to see what lies in the beyond. And in order to do so, he employed numerous experimental techniques. And here's a similar portal. In the upper half of this picture, you can see here a purple lower part of a portal going off towards the right, the horizontal part. And that's what it looks like in natural daylight, a photograph of that particular portion of the portal. Below, we can see in ultraviolet light many of the layers of technique that he used. And to achieve this sort of hovering effect that he was striving for, which I have to confess doesn't project well here, but I think if you see the work itself, you'll see exactly what I'm getting at. In order to achieve that effect, it wasn't just paint on canvas. He started off with some dry paint itself. He then smeared that on the canvas, and on top of that, he would put beaten egg, white and yolk together, and he would plaster that on to keep the particles of pigment on the canvas. And on top of that, he would put diluted pigment. And then on top of that, he would put resin. And then he would put more egg, more dry thing, building up layers and layers and layers, so that as you looked at this picture and walked around it from side to side, the light would be reflecting in a slightly different way according to where you positioned yourself, and the whole picture seemed to come alive. And this is what he was striving for. And here he finally arrives, and again, forgive me for showing this through the electronics of a projection on a screen, of a photograph in a book taken of a work of art in a museum. So we're 4 layers removed, so I have to apologize because I may not be convincing, but let me convince you at least to go and look at a Rothko in a museum and stand up to it, see it exhibited in its low light as intended. And you will indeed be struck by the vibration of the frame, and you will want to know what lies beyond that frame. In the same way that we saw that Malevich picture, do you remember, white on white, and Malevich says, enter the inner rectangle, because that is where creation takes place. And that resonated with Rothko, and that was what he was all about. He wanted to go to that space where he would be able to express the essence of the essential. Not abstract art, nothing to do with representation. He was trying to express the essence of the essential, which harks back, I think, to his Talmudic education. Because what were the rabbis trying to do with the interpretation of the Torah? But to find the essence of what is behind the words in the 5 books of Moses. So you're trapped by your upbringing, you're trapped by your history, you can't escape it, whatever you do in later life. And looking through that portal at the back there, I think even in this projection you can see it's not just a plain black area, it's not got a tinge of red in it, it's obviously multi-layered, multifaceted. And today we can actually see what lies beyond there thanks to the Hubble telescope. And this, I think, is exactly what Rothko was after. Where to exhibit his work? After all, he had to earn a living as an artist. He had nothing but contempt for people who wanted decoration for their rooms. And here he is with his wife, Alice, who he called Mel. And he had received an invitation from the Seagram Drink Corporation of Canada, who had put up a glittering sort of Donald Trump-like building in Midtown Manhattan. And they wanted Rothko to produce some murals for the boardroom. Well, that was a wonderful commission, because he thought, well, a boardroom is a single room, there'll be no other art there, it'll be a place of thoughtfulness, intellectual debate and discussion about the future of the Seagram company. And he accepted the commission and accepted a generous handout at the beginning, an advance of $60,000 at the time, before he'd actually produced the first work. And for the next 2 years, he produced some 20 canvases in that style of the spirituality that he was trying to find, seeking the essence of the essential beyond the frame for the boardroom. Until he discovered that the directors of the Seagram Corporation had changed their mind, and it was no longer going to be in the boardroom, but was actually going to be on the walls of the restaurant. And he told this to Mel, his wife, what to do. After all, this was a huge commission. He'd spent 2 years of his life working on this. And he said to Mel, "They're going to put my murals in a restaurant where the richest bastards in New York will come to feed and show off. I hope to ruin the appetite of every son of a bitch who eats there." But having thought about it, he obviously withdrew from the commission, returned the advance that he'd received, and then gave away the murals that he'd prepared for the Seagram Corporation to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and to the Tate Gallery in London, where it's now housed in the Tate Modern you may have seen. The Seagram murals, they're known as. And the only condition that they would have them for free at no charge whatsoever would be they would be exhibited according to his requirements in low lighting. This is in order to take the photograph, the lights have gone up, but when you go there, it's a darkened room, essentially. No barrier, no frame, no signature allow you to enter into the space beyond the canvas itself. 10 years later, he receives another commission, this time from the Menil family. The Menils were French Huguenots who had emigrated to America and made their fortune in mining machinery in the 19th century. And with the foundation's money, they established a university in Houston, Texas, and also wanted Rothko to furnish with murals a dedicated chapel which would be dedicated to Rothko himself and the paintings housed within. At last, the commission that he'd been yearning for all his life. So he set to work on those murals, producing some 20 or 30. And there they are installed. And again, we don't do justice to the murals because we have to turn the lights on in order to be able to photograph them. But instead of the windows, the frame in which you enter to the cosmos or beyond or wherever you want to go, spiritually speaking, hard-edged pictures in shades and shades of purple and mauve and blue and black. And as you go in there, it's a spiritual experience. I've not been, I'm embarrassed to say. Perhaps some of you have. But apparently it's a spiritual experience, and people who come out are transformed by seeing Rothko's murals in what is now known as the Rothko Chapel. And people asked him, "Rothko, what was your intention here?" And he says, "Well, if people want sacred experiences, they will find them here. If they want profane experiences, they'll find them there too. I take no sides," which is a sentiment of a pure artist, I think you would agree. But now, suddenly, Rothko's health takes a turn for the worst. He's suddenly smitten with intense pain in the chest that goes through to his back. He's taken to hospital, and he's found to be severely hypertensive and actually having a dissecting aortic aneurysm. And I'm not sure if you know what that is, but it's almost universally a fatal condition in which the blood from the aorta, the great vessel coming out of the heart to feed the rest of the body, the wall actually perforates partially, allowing the blood under high pressure to get into the wall of the aorta and then dissects the whole wall, and almost invariably there's massive blood loss and the patient dies very, very rapidly. Miraculously, Rothko survived that. His hypertension was brought under control. He spent 3 weeks in hospital and seemed to have got over his dissection, obviously still brittle, but was able to go back home and carry on. But his confidence was now completely shattered. He was also dismayed that abstract art or whatever he was trying to do was really misunderstood, and art dealers weren't interested in what he had to offer. Everything was now surrealism and pop art and all other things in the 1950s. He went into a phase of black paintings reflecting his very somber mood. He was drinking heavily, he was smoking heavily, and his marriage to Alice Mel was now on the rocks. And he actually moved into his own studio away from Alice and the children. She looked after them. And he was a sad and lonely man, broken physically and emotionally, very, very vulnerable. And went into this phase of these black paintings. Shortly after 9 o'clock, on the 25th of February 1970, his assistant opened the door of his studio and was surprised not to find Rothko sitting on his chair contemplating one of his great murals that he was trying to develop. Instead, he could hear in the background a tap running. And the back of the studio, because Rothko was now living there, having separated from Mel. And Rothko had built at the back a little kitchen and a little shower area where you could take a bath. The assistant went to the back, saw the sink overflowing with water, the water cascading onto the floor, and there in a pool of congealed blood was the lifeless body of Rothko. On the sink was a double-edged razor blade with which he had slashed the inner aspect of his left elbow, severing the brachial artery, and he died very rapidly. There was also a bottle of Seconal sleeping tablets, which was empty, his trousers neatly folded on a chair to the side. So Rothko's suicide then had a profound effect on the art world. And I'd perhaps leave the last word to describe Rothko, the word of Dominique de Menil, who had sponsored Rothko to produce his murals for the chapel. And Dominique said, as he worked on the chapel, which was to be the greatest adventure of his life, his colors became darker and darker, as if he were bringing us to the threshold of transcendence, the tragic mystery of our existence. And isn't that what he did? So if you say Kandinsky, wonderful. But if you say Rothko, he's finally reached, I think, the soul. Thank you.